But then what I went on to say is that in the prayer of the Mass and what we celebrate today, Scripture tells us that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. So we believe that heaven and earth come together in the prayer of this Mass, and that we are gathered with all of those who have gone before us. So even if the church were to be empty, we would be full of those who have gone before us. It's about perspective, isn't it? As we think of those men and women who have gone before us, the question that I'd like to pose for our consideration this week is, are we propelled by faith or are we paralyzed by fear? Are we propelled by faith or are we paralyzed by fear? And I would invite us to go to the very beginning of the Scriptures when the Lord called Abraham. Called him to go to some place that was foreign to him. Didn't give him any kind of instructions into how that would go and what he would encounter along the way. He simply said, go. As a way of prayer, I would invite us to go to the book of Hebrews and read chapter 11. That's a homework for today, for this week. Because everything it says is that Abraham acted by faith. And yet, there's this tendency of fear, isn't there? We are all given the same invitation, maybe not as profound or extraordinary as Abraham had, or maybe even as Moses. No, the Lord doesn't appear to us in a burning bush, or at least the Lord hasn't appeared to me that way, but in very ordinary ways. Perhaps in a conversation with a friend, you hear something, or in a song that you listen to, or in a word that you read. In that simple, very ordinary glimpse of grace, God is speaking to us. So what do we do with it? I'm glad you asked. In the gospel today, we have this idea of talent. One of the biblical scholars says that a talent in ancient times was also used as a symbol for teaching. So there are 3 life lessons for us today. The first is one of courage. The second is one of faithfulness. And the third is one of action. And again, when we think of men and women who have gone before us, don't they have all of those 3? In an interview with Mother Teresa, before she died, she said to a reporter that if she knew what God was going to call her to do, she never would have started. The enormity of the service that she provided. And she said that she did it serving one person at a time. What has God called us to do? How has God invited us into service? And again, are we propelled by faith or are we paralyzed by fear? Courage, the definition of courage, is simply the ability to do something difficult even when there's a risk. The story that's presented to us in the gospel gives us 3 examples. The first they took a risk, but the second one was paralyzed by fear. He was so afraid to fail that he didn't even start. He didn't even do anything. Isn't failure sometimes a good teacher? Because when we fail, we learn from our poor choices or those things that we tried to do and maybe weren't successful at. And yet those can be good guiding posts for us as we move forward. Friends, as we anticipate this wonderful holiday of Thanksgiving, we are mindful of the many blessings that God has given to us. Sometimes those gifts that we take for granted. As we prepare to celebrate on Thursday, I would invite us to be mindful of how God has blessed us. And perhaps how God is inviting us to share those blessings with one another. We have this wonderful tradition of the giving tree. And I've heard that this parish is very generous in how they share. Perhaps the Lord is inviting you to take a name from the tree and to be mindful and thoughtful of how you can pay forward what God has been generous to us. Our Peace and Social Justice Committee, along with the Catholic women of the parish, have been so thoughtful in collecting coats and clothes for the people of Chicago at St. Rita Parish, where Father Romero and Father Sam serve. I think they've taken over 20 carloads of goods to St. Rita. When Mary and her husband were driving to the parish at St. Rita, they passed the police station where some of the folks are staying. And Mary says, "Father, there's so much more that we can do." And so I was talking to one of the organizers in Chicago, and I told her, I said, "What can we do?" And she said, "Father, the kids need coats." You know how cold it is in Chicago, isn't it? The temperatures are going to dip later this week. And we might think, do I have an extra coat, extra jacket in my closet that I'm not using? Perhaps that's a way to share something that we can give. And we might think, well, that doesn't mean a lot. It doesn't make that much of a difference to us, but to the person who's going to use it. So those are just a few examples of how God is calling us to serve. And so as we gather on Thursday as a family of faith to give thanks for all that we have, let us be mindful of how God is asking us to share. As a way of our prayer, as we gather at the table, maybe to be mindful in a very specific way. Say, "Lord, today I am thankful for." And let's not be so rushed to dig in as much as the food is delicious, isn't it? But be able to say, what am I thankful for? And then how is God asking me to share? Today as we gather around this table, we bring all of our fears, those fears that are spoken and unspoken, so that they be transformed. As the body and blood is transformed for us, food for our journey, we call it, so that we can share God's good news.